Just a minute.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Uh, Hello. Good morning. Professor Jodhka, Professor Surinder Singh Jodhka has joined with us, and he will deliver the keynote address of the online 3-day online workshop on of Polis and People Cities Caste Cards. Professor Surinder Singh Jodhka is a professor in Jawaharlal Nehru University, and he absolutely needs no introduction. Uh, we all know that he has been working for a long period on social stratification, social identities formation, caste studies, religious minority studies, and many of us would probably agree that whenever we have started our journey regarding research like researcher on caste history or caste sociology, uh, we began our journey by reading Professor Jodhka's Caste in Oxford, a short introduction series. So it's a very exciting moment for all of us to listen to Professor Jodhka. Um, and uh, Without delaying anymore, I would request Professor Surinder Singh Jodhka right now to begin his keynote address. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Abhijit, for asking me to speak and for your very nice introduction. Yeah, 3 years back, we shifted to this online format because of pandemic, and over the last 3 years or whatever 5 semesters, I've realized that the last thing we should do is to interact online. Generally, try to kind of avoid any online lecturing. It's terrible. Please don't do it. Please don't carry on with it. I've stopped teaching classes online. I did it last semester when COVID was still around. I think it is it's not a very good practice, as to put it very simply. I think this is an accidental experiment which has definitely failed. So I would like to see faces. If you have data, if you don't have any other excuse, please switch on your cameras. It makes a lot of difference. Unless you see faces, I mean, I can't think. Many of you perhaps also would be teaching and talking. If you have to speak to a computer, to a wall, I'm sure you would find it very difficult to think. You don't really know whether the other person is listening to you or not, whether the other person is smiling or being indifferent, and that makes a lot of difference. And I think we are not able to do that. So I personally don't like doing this kind of thing, but I understand that this is being organized online. Therefore, one has to do it because it is not a learning experience. I mean, every interaction should also be a learning experience for everyone. Unless I see you, unless I get your feedback, unless I hear back from you, it's not much fun for me. Okay. I also prepared some slides. I thought since it is going to be online and I knew people would not be looking at my faces, so one should have something to look at the computer. I hope I can share it.
Yes,
Can
you
I
can. Yeah,
share?
yeah, yeah, yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
Just a minute. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I suppose this. Can you see my slide?
Yes, this is visible. Yeah.
Okay. Uh, okay. Yeah. It's kind of. Yeah. Now I can see it clearly. Just a minute. Let me set it up. I'll try to wind it up in half an hour so that we have some time for discussion. Uh, this is very interesting kind of subject, the way it has been introduced. And I'm very happy that people who are doing literature and now even economists are working on caste. People who are doing arts and aesthetics are also working on caste. So until some time back, as you know, caste was seen as something which only anthropologists and sociologists study. Other people who have more sensible perspectives, people who talk about politics, they would talk about democracy, occasionally talk about caste, but primarily they would be focusing on question of rights and political systems and stuff like that. Likewise, economists, when they thought about economy and development. They thought caste was just a distraction, and the real thing was poverty and inequality. And when you're talking about poverty and inequality, you don't need to look at your society, you need to look at general frameworks about income and disparities and stuff like that. Even something like that did not, in some sense, invoke the question of caste. Literature obviously has been, at some level, a divided house. I mean, there are people who speak from their own experience, and those who are, particularly English literature, has its own kind of English bias, which is obviously understandable, and you are already always communicating with the classic canons, which are all in English language and written in the Western context. But I think caste has been very central to everything that we do, including private lives, personal lives, neighborhoods, cultures, traveling, whatever we think of. And we don't talk about caste sometimes, but it's very good that now we are beginning to talk about caste. For the last 20 years or so, things have been changing, and I've seen in the last 5-10 years, everyone feels compelled to recognize the reality of caste, which is very good. And that's how we can begin to engage with each other, learn from each other. So let me briefly kind of introduce you to the subject from my own perspective. This might be very, very elementary for you, but I think some of those elementary things also carry certain kind of assumptions, which, unless engaged with, are taken for granted, and then they end up shaping our research questions and the way we, in some sense, move forward when we are talking about caste. So, framing of caste in relation to city obviously is very, very critical. Let me redo it. This is not moving.
Okay, sure, sir. Yeah.
Just 1 minute. Yeah. Just a minute. It disappeared. Yeah. Okay. Some problem with my computer, I think. Yeah, so when we are talking about framing of caste, I think we also need to raise some questions which go beyond what we are talking about, and that's what I will try to discuss. Uh, I think when Abhijit or others who were thinking of organizing this conference, in the frame in which it has been, in some sense, structured, there's a very clear, at some level, attempt at, in some sense, saying that we need to recognize that when we think about city, we also need to think about caste, or when we are thinking about caste, we also need to see it in relation to city. And this, in some sense, is not simply an ordinary statement, because underlying this is also a framing of our own contemporary contexts. And this contemporary context, the way it is framed, and something that perhaps you're already thinking about, the moment we think about city, we think about a particular kind of collective life, a particular life, kind of being, a particular, in some sense, way of association, the way we interact with each other, the way we think about each other, the way we relate to each other, the way we live with each other in terms of neighborhoods, in terms of economic life, in terms of political engagements, associations, or other kind of civil society engagements. So this framing is also very hegemonic. You all know the word hegemonic. I don't need to explain that. And these are not simply academic exercises. Even the word hegemonic, though it sounds academic, it has a larger, in some sense, political meaning. So when we are talking about city and caste, we are not simply talking about some academic concerns which help us frame our research questions, but we are also invoking our own identities and our place in the larger world, not only in the city in which you live, not only in the state in which we grow up or families in which we grow up, but also the larger global kind of context. And therefore, as I said, they are deeply political in more than one ways. And this is what I want to kind of, in sense, start with. So, how does it become hegemonic? How does it become political? They are hegemonic because when we are talking about caste and city, we are not only talking about caste and city, we are also talking about the opposite of city that we have in mind, and that is the village. That it is all right to have caste in the village, and that's where it legitimately belongs. But when we come to city, caste ought to disappear, or caste, in some sense, on its own would disappear. And this is not something that this note is saying. What I'm trying to say is that this is the underlying assumption of our time. Underlying assumption of our time is also that we are living from 19th century, early 20th century onwards, in a moment where everything is changing. And everything is changing in our social life. Our economies are becoming more urban and non-agrarian. Our lives are becoming more anonymous. Everyday life is, in some sense, structured around individual choice and stuff like that. So everything around us is undergoing change, and we begin to think of change as, in some sense, a defining feature of our life. Even when we are doing academics, why do you want to do PhD? Because I want to bring about change in society. Why do you want to become a doctor? I want to do something for society. Why do you want to be a scientist? Because I want to do something for the larger world. The way world is, it must change. But this change is not simply a matter of choice. If we think about it a little more critically, this change is framed within what I would call as teleology of the modern or modernity. And this modernity, in some sense, becomes so hegemonic that it becomes our common sense, right? Everything, all our morals, in some sense, are judged in relation to the idea of modernity. And this then brings it the question of what I kind of frame as imperative of change. The change is not something that we choose. Change is something that we live in, and we ought to assist that change. And this is not only left-wing comrades who would talk about, almost everyone. If you go and talk to an RSS person, they would also say that we are change agents. So an active, uh, what one should say, meaningful actor is essentially has to be change agent. And and the present context would also, in some sense, pre-frame this direction of change. And the direction of change is always visualized in singular terms. That is a particular direction in which the change ought to happen, right? There's a kind of a moral agreement globally, and that is that villages will die and cities will come into existence. But when we think about village and city in this framework of change, we don't look at them as social processes. We don't look at them as economic processes. We don't look at them as relational structures. We look at them as sui generis realities. Sui generis is a word which was popularized by French sociologist Emile Durkheim. If you don't understand the word, if you've not heard it before, in very simple language, it's a French word for describing things out there, right? When we are talking to each other, all of us are speaking in front of a computer or a laptop or a mobile phone device, and we have some of us would have a copy and a pen in our hand. So now these are fixed structures, in the sense that this pen has a life and it is fixed. You can open it, you can use it, and you can close it, and you can keep it. It will dry, it will get over, it can be revived perhaps. Likewise, a notebook is a notebook. So when we think about social realities, when we think about city, and when we think about villages, we also tend to attribute similar kind of features to them. That they are fixed realities like sui generis, and these then have to change. And the choice that village has is simply to, at some level, develop in a manner that in the process it also kills itself, that it becomes urban, right? So urbanization is a demographic process, but it is also a process of evolution. It's a particular direction in which it ought to travel. So there is a kind of particular narrative in which then village and city are seen, and this framing then also becomes part of our common sense. When we argue about some ordinary things, we invoke these ideas whether we like it or not, and these are obviously taught to us as principles, as realities of life when we are growing up, and they enter almost everything. When you watch a movie, when you talk to your friends, when you go to your college, when we walk in the street, when the state frames policies, so they become common sense. And I think common sense is very, very important category which I'm going to invoke. A problem with this kind of narrative of change is that it is not a reality, right? It defies history. The historical processes are very different. So let's now come to caste. I mean, that was my broad, in some sense, starting point. So caste is one such subject which is talked about in the present, in this imperative of change, in this teleology of modern, in this narrative of rural and urban, and in this kind of, commonsensical understanding of what we ought to be in the present day world. So when we think about caste, we should recognize, I mean, there are certain caveats which I often flag when I start talking about caste. And we must recognize that even though it seems like something which everyone knows, everyone has an understanding about it, but caste is a difficult subject because we think we know about it, because it is also part of our identity. And that identity, that we are also located within the caste system, irrespective of our religious identities, whether we believe in caste system or not, whether we are Brahmanically oriented or not, we do have caste identities. Almost in India, everyone has a kind of caste identity, except for certain communities which would call themselves as tribals, but they also tend to have similar kind of hierarchical structures within those tribal collectives, and lots of people have worked on it, and which is also very similar to caste like realities. uh, so when we have a particular location within a system, that location also tends to shape the way we look at the system, whether we like it or not. All these identities matter, and these locations then also shape the way we look at the larger structure. If you happen to be an untouchable Dalit, your experience of caste is shaped by your location in the caste system, and your understanding of caste, whatever text you may read, is also shaped by that experience of untouchability or marginality or location. Like gender is very similar to caste. Likewise, if you are a privileged upper caste, a so-called upper caste, you also have certain experience of caste. Absence of certain experiences, that also shapes your own judgment about what caste is. So that makes it very difficult to think about caste objectively, as one would say. So identities and locations matter, and I think this needs to be recognized when we begin to engage with the reality of caste, that we also have our identities, we also have our location. For example, if I have to talk about gender, the first thing that I need to recognize that I'm a man, right? Or if I am a woman, that also in some sense needs to be recognized, that my experience of being gendered is also written all over my body, and it is not only on my physical being, it is also written all over my kind of identity of my culture, the way I see myself. Right from the moment you are born, those identities are in some sense inscribed inside you, over you, on the side of you, in front of you, behind you. So that is what in some sense, what I call as inescapable politics of caste question. So my location and identity in some sense need to be foregrounded, need to be reflected upon, if I have to talk about gender and caste, right? As one has to kind of remember oneself being male or female, being old and young, being whatever color of skin and stuff like that. So these identities need to be recognized. Not that, I don't care about it. I'm a scientist and I'm going to approach it scientifically. That is just an escape. But actually, those identity, even if you're a scientist, the access that you have to certain kind of reality in society would be already shaped by your gender and your location in the larger context. But that doesn't mean that we cannot engage with those subjects. I mean, I could be, uh, I'm a Sikh, I wear a turban. Uh, we don't have Brahmin, for example, in Sikh religion. We don't have a priestly caste. Anybody can be can read the book. Formally, religiously, we don't believe in caste system. But I do have a caste identity. I do have my location. Even if I don't have caste identity, my location being outside it would also matter. If a black person comes from, in some sense, Kenya or South Africa and wants to study a neighborhood in Calcutta or a village in Punjab, his experience is going to be very different from a white woman coming from United States and studying those things. So those identities also matter. So if you look at the academic literature, social science literature, it has engaged with these questions, and it also has engaged with the question of history. How much time have I already taken?
We have still 23 minutes in this
Yeah,
session.
yeah. So yes. So one of the biggest problem with caste, keeping all that I've said in mind, is that the moment you talk about caste, you immediately have a position on it. All of us have position on it. And when we think about its persistence, that's what is driving this workshop, that caste is not something that has gone away. It ought to have gone away. That is the assumption. That's why we talk about persistence. As I said, there is a kind of imperative of change, that caste ought to have gone away, because now India is not a rural society. India is not an underdeveloped country. But then why does it persist? It persists, according to most middle class Indians, urban Indians, people like us, is because state system has institutionalized caste in terms of quotas, which is empirically true. I mean, we have a new imagination of caste which comes to us from the legal framework, from the constitutional framework within which we are organized. That is, there are general category people, there are scheduled castes, and there are now OBCs and stuff like that. So that framing obviously gives it a different life. Another explanation that is given is that caste actually would have disappeared but for the political elite of India, or what one would call as political entrepreneurs. And they are so crooked that they would mobilize, they would use anything in order to gain support, electoral support, and they mobilize caste. And because they mobilize caste, that's why caste exists. There is an element of truth in this, but it's much more complicated, right? The third explanation obviously is that because of Hindu conservatism, that because Indians are very Brahmanical and they don't want to get out of their religious traditions, and that's why caste persists. And the fourth explanation, popular explanation, is in persistent India's backwardness, that India is still a largely rural country. Three-fourths of India still lives in villages, and people are backward. There's lack of education, lack of rational thinking. And then finally, there are also those people who would say that it doesn't matter. Now, all these explanations are weak explanations, right? There is some element of truth in some of those things, but we need to raise certain different kinds of questions if we have to understand the persistence of caste. Now, caste is not what we assume it is. What we assume it is that caste is a traditional system of hierarchy. Because it is a traditional system of hierarchy, when society is modernized, caste ought to disappear on its own. It's like darkness. The moment you switch on your light, the darkness will go, right? As I said right in the beginning, imperatives of modernity, that modernity would take us in a particular direction. That's why this question is framed in relation to city, that in city, caste ought not exist, because we travel in transport, public transport, where you don't know who is the passenger sitting next to you. You don't know what caste the conductor has. You buy ticket from him or her. He or she could be an untouchable person, or the other way around. The person who is from an untouchable community also has to be treated equally or has to be given the ticket, but you have to interact with each other. Likewise, you go to a restaurant, you eat together, you don't know who is serving you. You don't know who has first used the same cup or plate in which you are drinking your tea or coffee or food. So, in some sense, we assume that the moment you urbanize, caste automatically disappears. And as we become modern, caste will automatically disappear. And that's what, in some sense, most people thought when India was becoming modernized. But why did it come to be seen as a traditional system? Right? There are many other structures in society. For example, kinship. We have relatives, we have families, we get married. Right? These are also structures which have existed for a very long time. Why is it that we don't think of them, that they will also disappear when we become modern? So, in order to understand that, we also need to understand how this commonsensical understanding of caste comes to be hegemonic and begins to rule over us. And then we begin to see ourselves with a sense of deficiency. If caste exists, that means there is something wrong with us, there is a lack of change. So, one way of doing it is to just look at the peculiar trajectory of caste. Caste is now universally identified with, for example, Indian society. That's where caste exists within India. Caste is identified with Hindus. Now, it is very interesting that it is a reality that there is text called Manusmriti, which is supposed to have been written by a Hindu saint, and Smritis are also part of Hindu mythological canons and various other things. But actual trajectory of caste is very different from the way we think it to be. Caste is not an Indian word. You would say, how does that matter? There are many other words which are also not Indian, but they have become part of life. Yes. But if you look at the history of the word caste, it actually comes to us from Europe. As many of you would know, the Portuguese were the first to use this word when they landed on the India's west coast. They saw something very familiar, and they thought that this looks like what we have at home in our own society, and that was caste. Right? That's how they use the word caste. We do have categories like varna and jati and their subunits, but in reality, we don't have one caste system. Right? The idea of caste system is itself a very problematic category. We do have structures of hierarchies, and those structures of hierarchies all regional in character. I mean, somebody like, I give example of a Namudri Brahmin of Kerala and his relationship with an Iyengar Brahmin of Tamil Nadu. They are neighbors, right? They could actually be living in the same village. But a Iyer Brahmin of Tamil Nadu would have nothing to do with a Namudri of Kerala, even though they are both Brahmins, right? When it comes to marriages, when it comes to actually recognition of status, Namudris will think of Nayars and Ejavas and other communities in their own social context. Likewise, Ayers and Iyengars will think of the non-Brahmins and the Dalits in Tamil society. So the point I'm trying to make is that in reality, the ground reality, empirical reality of caste is jati based. The varna and jati are also generic terms which are used for various things. Like you ask a botanist who works in Hindi or other regional language, they'll use the word jati for plants. There are different kinds of plants, different jatis of plants. Varna, as Ambedkar also had said, Varna basically just means color or classification, a system of classification. They don't really have a specific inherent meaning which the word caste has. The moment you invoke the word caste, it implies hierarchy, while Varan just implies classification. Jati just implies classification, even though they have come to be used in a particular manner. Now we have terms for these things. I don't know about Bengali language and Bengali culture, but for hierarchy, like we have Zat and Biradri in Punjabi. Now, Biradri is a word which is not used in any other culture. Some people use the word Biradri in a slightly different manner, but these are more like horizontal collectives rather than vertically structured collectives. Vertically structured collectives are always local, right? So every region, like I was talking to you about Kerala and Tamil Nadu, would have these structures which are locally identified. Now, uh, these are social realities which existed in India, which have existed in India for a very, very long time. I mean, you would find references to it in classical Hindu texts, right? In classical Buddhist texts, in the 14th, 15th, 16th century, when people like Nanak are writing and he's interacting with Kabir and Ravidas and many other people of his time from different parts of the subcontinent, they're all talking about inequalities. They're all talking about hierarchies. They're all talking about caste in a particular manner, but they are not using this word in a purely religious sense of the term, right? So when does it come to be identified with a particular notion of India? And that notion of India is also produced exactly at the same time when the narrative of caste is produced in a particular manner. And that is what I call as the Orientalist turn, where India begins to be seen as a land of Hindus, right? And Hinduism is also in the process produced or imagined as a Semitic religion. And that Semitization of Hinduism is built into the way caste becomes a religious practice rather than a social institution. And I think this is kind of, we don't have time to discuss this, but if you have some questions, we can then talk about it. So one needs to kind of recognize that this is a construct of the 19th century, that caste is a Hindu religious value and practice is not something that is empirical reality, historical reality, because Hinduism is also not a singular reality. There are varieties of Hinduism, right from ancient times. You talk to any historians, I think a good article for you to read would be Romila Thapar's Imagined Religious Communities, where she says that yes, there were Brahmanic traditions, and these Brahmanic traditions obviously preached and advocated hierarchies of Varna and Jatis, but there were also Shramanic traditions in ancient times. And from ancient times until very recently, those Shramanic traditions have continued to struggle with Brahmanic traditions, right? So the narrative of caste that you have indigenously is very different from the colonial Orientalist Hindutva narrative of caste as being Indian caste system. Right? We are talking about hierarchies, but these hierarchies are constantly being questioned. And there are multiple ways in which, quote unquote, Hindus live their religious life. Large majority of Hindus have never needed Brahmins as priests. Right? So Brahmin is very central to this conceptualization of caste. So the mediation of Brahmin is limited to a small section of Hindus, historically speaking, right? And that small section of Hindus is not every Hindu, right? But somehow the way it has come to be understood and the way even critique is produced of Hinduism is based on this assumption that Hinduism is a one religious system. And this whole idea of religious system is actually not a South Asian idea. It's a very the article of Romila Thapar is Imagined Religious Communities. You can download it from the net. Otherwise, I can also email it to you. It's just a research paper. Yeah. So the colonial rulers are trying to imagine India for themselves, and that imagination of India is then thrust upon us. And there are people like Raja Rammohn Rai who are very willing to take that notion of India because that gives them uh, their own identities, a kind of reformist self. So, what do you want to reform? You want to reform Hinduism. But Hinduism is not one ism. Hinduism is not one religious identity. You go to a village, you would find people practicing very different kinds of things. And you have this big thing about sati becoming the major question of reform in Bengal. But actually, who practiced sati? Would peasant have the choice of practicing sati? Would common people have the choice of practicing sati? it was practiced by a very small fraction of super elite, right? And that becomes the defining feature of Hindu culture. It was complete nonsense, right? Uh, the scholar Lata Mani has actually researched on it and has shown that how the practice of sati actually increases a slight, sees a slight increase after anti-sati law was framed. But for all of us, Raja Ram Mohan becomes the messiah who brought reforms, and all of us were sitting, living in this pathetic life earlier, where all women were burnt on the pyre of their husbands if the husbands died, which was complete nonsense. I mean, why then he was talking about widow remarriage if women were all burnt? No one thinks about this obvious contradiction in that kind of narrative. But that narrative comes to be the very hegemonic narrative, where caste is seen as the defining feature of Hindu religion. Hinduism is as seen as the religion of Indians. Everything else is of outsiders. Hinduism is seen as a singular religious system, like even Christianity and Islam are not singular internally, but that's how Orientalist writings produce it. And that Hinduism is then seen as being decadent. That Hinduism is seen as having had no history. That caste system is seen as having had no conflict. That caste system is then defined as a traditional structure of hierarchy in similar terms. Bengal would have gone through many changes over the past thousands of years, not always because they were reformers, but mostly because of ecological conditions, mostly because of historical accidents, mostly because of political processes. All that history, which is very regional in character, is completely erased by the colonial rulers, and then colonial anthropology of caste is produced. Let me try to wind up in next 5 minutes, and then the main assumptions of this that you already know, that you begin to think in terms of hierarchy and karma and moksha become the defining feature of Hinduism. Not that these ideas did not exist. These ideas existed, but they existed among a very small section of Brahmanic elite. Right? Large majority of Indians lived in variety of different ways. Were they Hindus? Well, yes and no. We don't really know. I mean, how they identified their religiosity. Even today, people who worship snake gods or those who are OBCs, they don't see themselves necessarily as Hindus. They are now becoming Hinduized, and that happens with nationalism. So this colonial framing of caste then completely erases materialities of caste. And that's something on which I've been working. That caste was not about religion alone. Religion was one aspect of life. The reality of caste was its materiality. That if you are a Dalit, you are not allowed to touch the plow. If you are not allowed to touch the plow, then you would also not cultivate land. If you don't cultivate land, you don't have control over land. If you don't have control over land, you remain as a slave of the landowner, those who have control over land. So these were relationships of domination and subordination, where caste was a very convenient way of institutionalizing those structures of inequality, right? Uh, okay, now last point that I want to make, because we don't have much time, is that it comes to be a kind of nationalist common sense. How does it become common sense? And it becomes common sense because I'll take this off, I think. Otherwise, I'll take much longer time. So how does it become part of our common sense? Why does it live the way it does today? It lives with us because of Indian nationalism. The nature of Indian nationalism was such that it, in some sense, uh, largely reproduced the Orientalist view of India. Right? Nationalism was a very creative moment in Indian history. All of these people we know, we keep talking about Gandhi, Nehru, Ambedkar, Raja Ram Mohan Rai, and many others, because these are the ones who actually defined us, our modern selves. Not that they were colonial minds. They were educated in colonial canons, and their understanding of India was not very different from the colonial Orientalist understanding of India. Almost all of them think of caste as a national system, as an Indian system, as part of Hinduism. If you look at Gandhi's writings, if you look at Nehru's writing, even Ambedkar's writing, which is empirically true, but they are not actually grounded. I mean, Gandhi and Nehru, they talk about village a lot, and Gandhi talks about village all the time. But he had never seen village until he comes back from South Africa. He was born in a town. His family was always urban. And then they are talking about India as being land of villages. Now, this whole idea of village and city is also a kind of book coming out from Aleph in August this next year, where I've tried to kind of critically examine this very notion of village and city as being two categories in the process of evolution. Historically speaking, they have co-evolved. The moment villages come, cities also emerge from ancient times when you have Harappa and Mohenjo-daros to Patliputra to Lahore to Hyderabad. In different moments in history that cities have been set up because there were elite formations, and those elite formations happen because you have settled agriculture. It's not because of the British colonial rule. It's not because of modern capitalism that cities emerge. Cities have always been there. And India has as much been land of cities as it has been land of villages. So there's a complete kind of misunderstanding, and this again is part of the colonial hegemonic narrative, which tries to tell us that India has always lived in its villages, which is empirically not the case. India had more urban population in 18th century than the total population of Great Britain. India had more people living in urban centers in 18th century than Europe had. And this is empirically documented by historians. Now, there are obvious problems with these kinds of guesses. Some people would say, no, you can't call them cities. But even urban centers in Europe could not be called cities before 18th, 17th century. Capitalism does change the nature of urban economy, fundamentally, no doubt about it. But not that urban life has not existed before that. So the final point that I was trying to say is that how the nationalists pick up these categories like village, caste, Hinduism, and then appropriate them as features of Indian culture, as features of Indian traditional culture, and that then becomes part of the Indian common sense. And that lives on with us. We don't have time, I'll stop now. That lives on with us, not only in our imagination, but also in our constitution. The Indian constitution, when it defines caste as a Hindu institution, Muslims are not given scheduled caste status because they are not Hindus, and caste is seen as Hindu religious institutions. And there are many other ways you would see that the colonial narratives tend to become, in some sense, empirical realities of India. We talked about reformers in Bengal and elsewhere. They, in some sense, buy into colonial narratives, and the way Hinduism is being imagined by the Hindu nationalists is also largely Orientalist notion of Hinduism. It's not empirical lived reality of religious life of people who could be broadly described as Hindus or who would want to call themselves now as Hindus. But in 17th century, they would have described themselves or their religiosities very differently. Even within village, you would find 5 or 6 different kind of religious identities through which people would identify themselves. Okay, sorry, I've taken all my time, but if you have time, I'm willing to respond to some questions.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, sir. Thank you for this thought-provoking lecture. And yes, we do have shortage of time, but still, we can have a very quick and very brief question answer session. We can take 2 to 3 questions. So, if you have any question, please unmute yourself and ask question to Professor Surinder Singh Jodhka. If you have any problem with your microphone, then you can also write your question down into the chat box. Yes, Rivu, please be very brief in your question. Yeah.
Sir, I'm a student of history. Historians like Kunal Chakraborty, they have suggested that the Brahmins, they were consciously, actually it was their community strategy to exploit the other people. So is it okay to blame Brahmins for the caste system?
Yeah, I mean, yes and no. There are all kinds of Brahmins. I mean, again, think of Brahmin as a homogeneous pan-Indian category is also very problematic. In some regions, Brahmins were very privileged class where they were given land titles and stuff like that. But in most regions, they were dependent communities. I mean, in the villages of Punjab, Brahmins were only slightly better off than Dalits. They were called upon to perform ritual services, particularly the Brahmin who performs ritual services, even now is so seen as a low status Brahmin. So there's nothing called pan-Indian Brahmin. Right? There are some regions historically, again, historians will tell you, it's like for example, Maharashtra in South India, to some extent Bengal, Brahmins were given land titles, where they emerged as a privileged class. Right? But at the same time, lots of people did not need Brahmins. Even today, if you go to Haryana, the Jats don't need Brahmins. Their ritual life has nothing to do with Brahmins. Large sections of religious communities, Indians did not need Brahmins. So this is overgeneralization. This is also kind of invoked as a kind of politically radical statement, but empirically it's very diverse. In some contexts, in Calcutta in 19th century, this might be true, or in Tamil Nadu in 18th century or 16th century, it might be true. But this can't be said about all kinds of Brahmins in all kinds of contexts, in all kinds of regions of the subcontinent. Yeah, there is some other question
Yeah.
somewhere.
In the chat
Sir,
box, there is yeah.
Yeah, please.
Okay, Balaka, please.
yeah. Hello, sir. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was very enlightening for all of us to hear. But I have a question that often, like in our classroom debates, and there are lots of readings that I came through, it has argued that, like, because of Hinduization in India and the majority influence in India and the caste influence that is there in the Hindu religion, it often has transferred from the culture has transferred from one religion to another, and it has argued that Islam basically religion do not have caste, but when it comes to India, there is hierarchy within Islam, and there are concepts of Ashraf Muslims and Paswanda Muslim, and there are seen that there are discriminations, and also within Christian religion also that Dalit have converted into Christian to come out from that agony of the caste. But then again in Kerala there were examples where in the
I followed your
upper
question,
caste.
Malika. Yeah,
Yes,
since we
thank
don't
you
have
so much.
time, I understand your question. I think
Yes.
one is working with the same narrative that caste is a religious reality. That's what I'm trying to contest. Caste is not a religious ideology. It is a religious ideology for a section of Hindus, but hierarchies are social structures. Ashraf and Ajilaf is not a Brahmanical influence. These kinds of caste hierarchies also exist in Iran. They also exist in Arabia. They exist in America, right? So hierarchies, structures of hierarchies have existed everywhere. And these are, I have a paper which you can circulate. I describe caste as a system of ascription-based hierarchies, right? And those, India has a particular kind of ascription-based hierarchy, but within India also there are varieties of them. So one needs to, if we had time, I would have discussed how we need to move from a religion-centric view of caste to a comparative understanding of caste as a structure of hierarchy. That's why urbanization will not take away caste. Urbanization, again, I had several slides on that. I've also done empirical work. But we need to look at the urban realities. Urban realities all over the world are caste realities. I mean, you go to Chicago, the first thing you would encounter is caste, not the Hindu caste system. The way city life is divided, and it is divided on ascription basis. There are people of Latino race, they would live in one locality, they pursue particular kind of occupation, they have specific status. Blacks of certain kinds are at the lowest end, right? Whites again have their own internal hierarchies, Indian fit in somewhere else. So there are structures, ascription-based hierarchies, which are constantly being produced and reproduced in different contexts. So these questions are also from the same Orientalist narratives that Hindus have caste. Therefore, Muslims in India also have caste, as if they don't have it in Pakistan, as if they don't have it in Bangladesh. Right? Ask anyone from Bangladesh, ask any, as if they don't have it in Indonesia. Right? Go study any of these societies, they all will have cultures of hierarchy. And there would be clear drawn boundaries. When it comes to marriages, they would fix marriages among certain kind of people of their own self. Right? That is the point I was trying to make. Yeah, there are some other questions also. One or two.
There is this is probably the last question that we can have.
Yeah,
Amit has already written his
sure.
question in the chat box for you, sir.
Yeah, can you read that question? Yeah, Amit can read it.
Yeah. Sir, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. I have a question in this regard. The question is that when the place of caste discrimination and recognition changes to city and village, but caste operation is everywhere, then caste association and assertion changes in terms of city and village as a reflection of that. So, can the caste groups of the city and the village never consolidate together in institutional politics?
Yeah, I mean, that is, see, it's a very interesting question. The first thing that we need to recognize is that that's why I'm criticizing the religious view of caste, that caste needs to be recognized as a political reality, that helps in reproduction of inequalities and hierarchies. It institutionalizes humiliation of certain kind, which disempowers individuals on the basis of their categorical identities, right? As the word is used. And these categorical identities are not unique to villages. These categorical identities, as I just said, they also exist in Chicago's, right? This book by what is his name? I forget his name. Who talks about categorical inequalities? He's not talking about India, right? He's actually talking about durable inequalities. Is the title of the book. He's talking about Europe. Pierre Bourdieu was not born in India. He didn't study India, but they're all talking about embodiment, right? So yes, I mean, when we think about inequality, again, economists would think of inequalities only in terms of income and wealth, but real inequalities are social and cultural inequalities, ascription-based inequalities, inequalities of caste and gender, and they need to be confronted at the social level, at the political level. Income distribution will not help. I mean, it's very critical, not that income is not critical. But at the same time, these hierarchies need to be recognized as social hierarchies, as structures of power and inequality, which are essentially political and social.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. We are, we are facing, time constraint. The things are really constant in each and every conference. Thank you so much for providing us food for thought. And this was really a very illuminating lecture, absolutely as expected. Yeah, so we end this session here. We probably had few more questions from a few other participants. If you permit me, then I can, collect the questions and mail it to you, so you can answer them, and I can, send your reply to them. I can circulate your reply to them. So we end this session here. The next resource person is present here with us, Professor Suchandra Ghosh. Professor Suchandra Ghosh teaches ancient Indian history in the University of Hyderabad. She is a very well-known researcher in this area of research. Uh, we are really fortunate enough that she has agreed to, deliver a talk on caste in ancient Indian urban settlements. And without delaying anymore, we are already, a bit late. So without delaying anymore, I would request Professor Suchandra Ghosh to begin her lecture.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yes. Actually, I'm having a lot of connectivity problem today. But anyway, I would not, after this illuminating lecture by Professor Jodhka, it really set the stage for my discussion today. And what I'm trying to do is I will actually talk about the ancient dynamics which I mean that we did not have the term caste as such. Like caste cannot be, or I can rather say that caste cannot be a translation of what we understand in ancient India as varna and jati. And he had raised the question of varna and jati. Varna, as we know, are the four varnas. And then when we have the intermixture of the varnas, then the new groups come up, and it is also an occupational group. So I would like to call it rather varna jati division and the urban space in early India. And talking about this is the whole project is very interesting. And I thought that since you have been working on this, so therefore let me start with Louis Mumford, which all of you have read. And so when we look at Lewis Mumford's work on the cities. So he describes the modern cities as the theater of social actions, where all the interactions in trade, commerce, social, and cultural interfaces take place. So this description of the vibrant city was appropriate for even ancient cities, where organic relations between cities and citizens were celebrated with similar enthusiasm. So cities indeed have occupied the central stage of human civilization much before the advent of modern cities that we find. Now, you are aware that Indian subcontinent witnessed earlier cities from the Bronze Age, which we call the Indus Valley Civilization or Harappan civilization, and going back to the 3rd millennium BC. It is also identified as a phase of first urbanization. Then we have the new phase of urbanism, which is from the early historical period, which is termed as second urbanization. And the reason was that it had an epicenter in the Ganga Valley. And from that, actually, we find that the geographical spread starts in different stages. Now, cities also find mentions in different kinds of texts and traditions almost continuously in the history of this subcontinent. So there was no break. And in the early medieval period, this kind of cities which grew from within has been termed as third urbanization. This was a word which was coined by Professor B.D. Chattopadhyay. Now, urban population, when we are looking at the urban population, so we know that there are different occupations to provide the services required to pursue a leisure life of the dominant section. So there is a service network too, extended beyond the city space and like beyond the city gates. And so this layered nature of the urban space was palpable through its urban architecture and planning, where the core with palatial buildings and best urban facilities such as squares. If you look at the ancient Indian texts, you have very beautiful description of the squares, the wide roads, and the gardens, which was often occupied with the power heads enjoying the ultimate benefit of the system. And there were also quarters for other functional groups. Now, when we look at the textual sources, we have in this category, we can refer to the Arthashastra. So in my presentation today, there will be 2-3 points which I will harp upon. One is the locus, that the plan of the city, and how for the normative text and the other kind of text, the Kavya literature, the Jain text, the Buddhist, Professor Jodhka was talking about the Shramanic text. Absolutely, this is very important that we look at the urban space, not only from the point of view of the Brahmanic text, but also from the Shramanic text of the Buddhism and Jainism. So, but our entry point to how the layout of a city was the Arthashastra, because it has a chapter on the planning and construction of a city called Durga Nivesha. And Durga implies a fortified, highly protected settlement, which in this chapter was the seat of the king, as well as a flourishing urban center. Now, since the Arthashastra is essentially a treatise on statecraft, advising a king on how best to organize his kingdom, and its affairs, the layout of the capital city, according to this text, is centered on the king's palace and its security. Thus, different sections of the city where commercial, ritual, residential, artisanal, administrative, and other functions were carried out were located by the text in relation to the location of the royal residence, and which is known as the Raja Nivesha. So you have in the northeast of the Raja Nivesha, the location of the priest. And so there are a lot of descriptions that where you have people, like you have dealers in perfumes, flowers, liquids, makers of toiletries, and this kind of things. I'm not going into the details, but let us just keep in mind that to the north were the Brahmanas, to the east were the Kshatriyas, in the southern quarter of the eastern direction were to be located the storehouse for goods and the workman's quarter. And normally we find that the Vaishyas lived in the southern direction and the Shudras in the western. So the Brahmanas were naturally offered the northern part towards together with the deities of the city. Now the point is, while the four varnas are assigned their respective residential areas in different cardinal directions, these were not clearly not mutually exclusive zones. And this has been pointed out by B.D. Chattopadhyay in his seminal essays on cities. Now, why it is so? Because this work and functional requirements would necessarily involve considerable interaction across all segments of space for all groups of people. So there is a profusion of socioeconomic diversity within an urban space. To give an example, if we have quarters where these people from occupational groups lived, so we have Malakara Bithi, like the garland makers. Now these garland makers would naturally go, they are making garlands and they supply flower to the temple and even to the palace. So these garland makers would naturally cross the regions or other areas of the livelihood or the neighborhood, and then would go to the palace or the temple. So therefore these cannot be mutually exclusive zones, that they are not stepping out of their own demarcated territory. Now in this case, the question of jati varna segregation, which we call caste segregation, appears as something of a theoretical rather than practical principle. I don't say that caste was not there, caste structure was not there, and I'll come to you that later on. But here, when we have a layout of a city done by Kautilya, like we call it Kautilya and Arthashastra, and we know that there are a lot of debates on the date of the Kautilyas, and it is now it is now thought about, like Patrick Olivelle and others, that we have to put it in the first quarter of the first century of the Common Era. Now, the point was to underline the material and ideological centrality of the king to all social and economic affairs of the realm. For the same reason, his palace was to be built on a site said to be fit for all four varnas to live on. So we have this term, Chaturvanya Samajive. Now, homes of the outskirts like the Chandalas were never to be within the settlement, but always outside it. That is a known fact. We all know that the Chandalas were outside the periphery. Manu Shranghita, Manu tells them that prescribes that they should be outside the city gate. But when we look at the notion of that they being the outside of the periphery of the city, they are not really outside the world of the city, because Chandalas posed a stark contrast to the ordered social order of the inner city. They cannot be outside the world of the city. And if we see Mrichakatikam, we find that the Chandalas in the role as executioners on duty could enter and negotiate their way through the city. So even their locus is outside the city. They had to come inside the city. And then this idea is also supported by Fashian's description of a Chandala, who says that when a Chandala enters the city of a middle kingdom, then people there were ringing of the bells and other things, so that there won't be any purity pollution. So could pass through. So the locus of the Chandala outside the city walls was there, of course, but he also in part, when necessary, it has to come into within the city. So it posed a stark contrast to the ordered social order of the inner city. Another important point that Chattopadhyay draws our attention to is the Vastu Chitra. Now, that the plan which I was talking about, that was the Vastu Vibhaga. So with Vastu Vibhaga, Arthashastra talks about Vastu Chitra, later being the area where no residence and perhaps no regular workplace existed. Then what was the purpose of Vastu Chitra? It was an area where the Srini and Pravahini Nikaya is a sect Nikaya group. So the Pravahini, the foreign merchants that has been translated, were located. Thus, through a Vastu Chidra, a major area of the economy maintained contact with the outside world of the Durga. So therefore, the Durga with its moat and its parapet and other, the confined city, then so that is the part of the Vastu Vibhaga, and then you have the Vastu Chidra, and which acted as a buffer zone between the areas outside the Durga and the Durga. Now the point is, whatever description of a city that Arthashastra provides us is standard and orderly. That we have made note of. The question remains, was it the lived experience of a city dweller? If we sift through our sources, we have to, here I have been a little not very organized and not taking sources chronologically. I have tried to, but taking sources from all kinds of reality. So like I have looked at the Jain sources, the Shamanic sources in totality, the Brahmanical sources, and also a little bit of the inscriptions, epigraphic documents. And what we find is that our sources direct us to a different reality. So in this presentation, what I'm trying to argue is that one cannot totally disregard, that it's true that we cannot totally disregard the Varna Jati system in an urban milieu. Urban landscape in early India is dominant, but what I'm trying to foreground is that the urban landscape in early India is dominated by the merchants, the artisans, the entertainers, and the likes. And therefore, the dynamics of Varna Jati system has to be read in a different note when we are talking of the early cities of ancient India, the cities of ancient India. So the clear-cut Varna ideology, the Varna divide, which can be shown in the theoretical Brahmanical texts, are not applicable Mana.
Ma'am, your voice is breaking actually. No.
Or a snataka, because it is said in the Dharma Shastras that a snataka is that. Oh, I think then just then connection is not good here. Was I audible from for the other part?
Yeah, absolutely. Just for the last 30 seconds, your voice was breaking. So I think you can actually switch off your video and continue. That would probably provide you a better connectivity.
Okay. I think that's better. Yeah. I think it's better. 1 second. Please alert me, okay, that if you can't listen to, or if my connection gets cut off, just send me a text message.
Sure.
Can you? Can you hear me now?
Absolutely perfect.
Yeah. Now, okay. So I was talking about the Brahmana quarters called Brahmana Pichika. Now it is often difficult to divide the Vaishyas and Shudras into two separate entities, particularly when we reach the Buddhist textual sources. We find that, and when we look at the other sources also, the distinction between the two was quite ambiguous in the middle and the lower Gangetic Valley, and as found from the Pali sources. Now, from this around the 7th century, it appears that from different sources that the Vaishya Varna more or less meant the merchants and the peasants, and artisans were in the category of Shudras. So the urban landscape was dominated by these two Varnas. So to repeat again, that in early sources, we do not find a very, like they are, sources are often bounded, like Vaishyas and Shudras are not always seen as very two different separate entities, because people, the occupational groups were also known as Vaishyas and also known as Shudras. But with the passage of time, as this Varna Jati system crystallized more, when we move into the early medieval period, we find that from around the 7th century, we have the Brahmanical sources, and it appears from that sources that the Vaishya Varna more or less meant the merchants, and the peasants and artisans, where the artisans were in the category of Shudras. The Chandalas, of course, were a separate, completely other category. Now, when we look at the question of urbanity in early South Asia, we find that it was responsible for not only creating a lifestyle, but also for defining the ultimate utilization of urban space and ambience that have numerous references in variety of sources. So the ambience was again central to the activities of an urban community. So I will be talking about the urban community when we talk about the Vaishyas, I'm focusing myself more on the early historical period today. So this urban world, which I mentioned a little bit, is generally posited against the rural world. In the Dharma Sutras, there is an apprehension about the city. So this apprehension is articulated in the sense that there is a kind of cacophony in the cities where Vedas cannot be recited and Dharma would be jeopardized. So contrary to this Dharma Shastric view, Kama Sutra, Sanskrit Kavya literature, and many other texts identify the city as a space where there is abundance of wealth and goods, imposing residences, heterogeneity. This is a very important part of a city. Convergence of varied people, which is also a venue of, and the city is also a venue of doubts, criticisms, and differences. If you read Chattopadhyay's essay, you'll find that he had tackled all these issues. And on the question of convergence, for early medieval period, I have looked at two cities. One was a port city of Sanjan, and another was the city of Anahilapura, which is an inland city. But in both the cities, we find the idea of notion of convergence of people from all around coming, which makes the city a microcosm of the human universe. So it was a universe of men who came together within the locus of the city. Now, individual characters in the city arrive from different places. They bring with them their peculiar regional practices so that they infuse the city with behavioral complexity as well. Now, therefore, I always say that we perceive a cosmopolis at every level. Now, going back again to Arthashastra, we find that though Arthashastra gives us prescription, tells us about the state, but it is a different kind of text. And it gives us also a list of entertainers who travel from one place to another. Patrick Olival has drawn our attention to this aspect of Arthashastra. And they are Nato, Nattaka, Gayana, Vadaka, Vagjivana, Kushilava. So that means actors, dancers, singers, musicians, birds, and performers. So the low moral, but there is, before I come to this point, let me tell you that these people are not given a very high position in the Dharma Shastras. There is a very low moral and social standing assigned to the entertainers in general by the didactic literature of ancient India, especially the Dharma Shastra, and it stands in sharp contrast to the significant social role that the entertainers play within society as depicted by Kautilya. So, and if we read Manu, we find the same is the case with the artisans. Manu strictly says that fruit should be restricted. People should not take food from an artisan, that is a karuka, but they were a very integral part of an urban space. Now, after giving this background, let me take you to an instance of an early historical urban center, which is not so famous, but which demands attention and was a point of convergence where merchandise, crowd, and heterogeneity could be perceived. My choice is Shakala. Shakala of literature has been identified with Sialkot in Pakistan. Incidentally, Sialkot was situated on the same road that connected Bactria with Ganga Valley. So it was also in the northern road, the Uttaravatha. It is between the rivers of Chenab and Egg, a small western tributary of the Ravi. Now that Shakala at some time was the capital of the Indo-Greek ruler Menander is known very much from the text Milinda-Paiho, datable roughly to the 2nd to the 1st centuries BCE. Now, according to the Milinda-Paiho, Shakala was given the term Puru Uttama Nagara. Puru Uttama. So a Puru, it is the Uttama, the most of the best of the Nagaras, the great city of the, and whose cities of the Yonakas or Greeks. Now, city is known in Indian literature as an important city of the Madra people also. So it is clearly described as a center of all kinds of merchandise for the Yavanas and a point of convergence of merchants. Let me read out that briefly how Milinda-Paiho describes Shakala. I quote, "Well laid out are its streets, Subivatta Vithi, squares Chatukka, crossroads Singhataka, and marketplaces. Well displayed are the innumerable sorts of costly merchandise with which its shops are filled. Its streets are crowded by men of all sorts and conditions. Shops are there for the trade of Varanasi muslins and other cloths of various kind, and sweet orders are exhaled from the bazaar. I'm not going into the details. Then there's a reference to the guilds of traders, Vanija Gana, in all sorts of finery, display their goods in the bazaars that face all quarters of the sky. And so this unquote, this description, though not supported by archaeology, because no excavation could be done in the Sialkot region, but we cannot ignore this. It talks of an urban center where life is vibrant and markets are bustling with activities. The mention of muslins from Varanasi is an indication of long distance trade network, and obviously through Tarapatha. Sialkot was situated on the same route as we have mentioned, so it was exposed to Central Asian connection. Then we have the jewels that jewel are also definitive indication of a Central Asian network, which is quite plausible because it talks of lapis lazuli from Badakhshan. So for an urban setting, we have all that is needed. And like perfume, fragrance, the everyday life, which is perfumes, we know, finds a pride of place in the everyday life of a man about town. Nagaraga. So organized mercantile activity is indicated by reference to Vanijagana. And Vanijagana is like a kind of a, we have the kind of guild activity, guild-like activity, and Putobhedana. Putobhedana is a center where you open the boxes, the lids of the boxes. So it is like the kind of a warehouse. Now, the picture that it offers is that of an urban center where we have convergence of people from all directions. It is clearly described as a center for all kinds of merchandise and a point of convergence of merchants. Now, the expression men of all sorts is also noteworthy. This might mean people belonging to various varna and occupations. Nowhere do we find any trace of separate varna jati division in this context. Now, from this description of the Shakalas, if I move to the to another text of the Jainas, but before that, if we consider the donative records, because these are of the similar time frame, on the 1st century CE, 1st century BC, we have a lot of donative records throughout the Buddhist sites in India. We find that the donors have rarely referred to their Varna affiliations, but indicated their occupational status. These donors often came from distant urban centers or port towns, but never the Varna affiliations is indicated. We have reference from Mathura, a marriage between a jeweler and an ironmonger, and it is not frowned upon, though it violated the orthodox Brahmanical norm. How open the society was can best be appreciated from the fact that a courtesan could offer a donation to a Jain religious organization without renouncing her profession or suppressing her mother's profession of a Ganika. So these are inscriptions found from Konkalitila in Mathura. The growth of urbanism, expansion of trade, and increasing monetization seem to have relegated the importance of birth as a determinant of social status in some of these urban spaces. Here I want to bring in Angavidya. It is a Jain text, Prakrit, written in Prakrit, and which is of the same 1st to 3rd century CE. And it refers no less than, it talks about the existing social groups. So first it enumerates the traditional 4 varnas. Then it speaks of social status being determined by birth as well as occupation, which is very important. He says that a Brahmana and a Vaishya, that is a Brahmana by birth and Vaishya by profession. I'll come to that later on. Example from other sources. Then we have the societies divided between the Ajja, the nobles, and the Mleccha. So in this way, the Angavidya actually gives us a very good picture of the social position, but for want of time, I'm not going into the details. But the important point is that it also talks about that a Shudra could raise himself to the status of an Arya by improving his economic condition despite his low birth. The impact of wealth appears to have put the age-old traditional orthodox Brahmanical social norms to severe strain here. Now, Vanija is the general term for merchants, and they mainly belong to the Vaishya Varna, as I have mentioned earlier also. But there were Brahmana merchants as well. The articulation of the Jaina text Angavijja is also reflected in the epigraphic records, where Angavijja talks about the Brahman, one is born Brahmana but takes up the occupation of a Vaishya. And a glaring example is the Pehua inscription of 9th century, which talks about a horse fair Ghotaka Yatra in the ancient Prithudaka in Haryana. And some of the merchants had Bhatta name ending, suggesting the Brahmana Varna status. But in actual practice, they were following the profession of a Vaishya. Then again, we have a seal which is found from a place called in Southeast Asia. It's in the lower Thailand, in the peninsular Thailand area, and where it reads the seal. There's an inscription in the seal. It reads Navika Brahaspati Sarmasya. Now Navika Brahaspati Sharma, alluding to the Brahmana Varna of this Navika. We know that Navikas were in the lower category of the social Varna status. Navika is a Shudra. So here we have this whole, the blurring of the boundaries, where a Brahmana could take different kind of professions, not always, but if there was exigency or there is some kind of difficulty, but these were happening. Now let me go to the drama Mritchakatika, where we find, and that's a very interesting evidence that we have. The Brahmana Sarvilaka is a thief, and a thief obviously needed many tools to be successful in his venture. Now, Brahmana thief was perhaps in an advantageous position. Why? Because he had a sacred thread. And this is articulated brilliantly by Sarvilaka. Sarvilaka quotes that a verse enumerating the benefits to be derived from the sacred thread by a Brahmana thief. And I quote him. With this, he is actually holding the Upavita, the sacred thread, and he says, with this he measures out a passage for his activity in the world, in a wall. With this he can unloosen the fastenings of ornaments. When the door is securely locked, this can open it, and it serves as a tourniquet when he is bitten by insects or snakes. When Shudraka makes him pronounce the various utilities of the sacred thread for a thief, one cannot miss the underlying sarcasm. A Brahmana using one of the primary symbols of his Brahmanahood for an act which was a Brahmana he is debarred from. And what is the locale? The locale is Ujjaini. It's an urban center. So from the kind of evidence that we find from Jain texts, Buddhist texts, and others, and the Brahmanic literature, there's another genre of text called the Jatakas. And there are many instances in the Jatakas which are also datable during the same period. And we find that there are descriptions of cities. And one of the, I'm talking about, I'll just take one or two examples. And throughout the Jatakas, we have very important references to cities like Varanasi, Kashi. But when we look at the Mahajanaka Jataka, it is a famous city. It talks about a famous city of Mithila. And I'm not going into the story of the Mahajanaka Jataka, but it is represented in the arts of Ajanta. It's a very famous Jataka story. And the layout, when the layout is of Mithila is shown, so it generally talks about occupational groups, Brahmanas, and when in case of Brahmanas, it says that the Brahmanas were wearing dhoti from Kashi. So the dhoti comes from Varanasi. This is important because it shows an urban space with merchant and merchandise brought from distant land. Then again, we have the Vidura Pandita Jataka, which is also very important Jataka. We have this in Jataka volume number 6. And it mentions also several occupational groups of a city. Now, these Jataka stories belong to the time when we have also resonance of such kind of description of cities in coastal cities in Tamil Nadu, and in Tamil epic like Silabadikaram. So I'm talking about the coastal city of Pumpuhara, and this all belong to the same time frame. And this this description of Pumpuhara has been explained by both A.K. Ramanujan and B.D. Chattopadhyay in their seminal works. But still, I cannot miss referring to this very important source, where we talk there, the whole inclination is that a city is a place for merchants, a city is a place for merchandise, and you have different categories of artisans and categories of peoples, the entertainers. These are all very important part of a city life. Now let me read a little bit of how Puhar or Pumpuhara is described. So it says that the city is of course having many foci, and when celebrations such as the festival of Indra take place, they all seem to come alive. It says, I'll read a very brief portion where my argument will be quite underscored. In the city itself stood the King's Way, the flagged car street, the market square, the boulevard where merchant princes dwelt, in tall mansions, the Brahman homes, the houses of landed families and the tenant, farmers, of physicians, astrologers, and those employed in other tasks, the broad street of the homes of those who with skill bored holes into bright gems, so referring to the manikaras, and those who polished ornate couches. In separate houses lived charioteers, bards, panegyrists, astronomers, handsome dancers, harlots, actresses of flower and betel girls, maid servants, professional musicians, drummers of various sorts, and jesters. So this description obviously finds resonance of the with also the Arthashastra description of when you talk of nutter, nutty, jesters, drummers, musicians. So these are all musicians, these are all part of an urban life. And therefore, when we talk about these things, when we read all these things, we cannot totally actually delineate these people from the city life and go back to the proper Varna the fourfold Varna division, and then of course the beginning of the different jatis. The Kavya evidence also deviates from the normative tendency to allocate a living and other space in the city on the basis of Varna. Many things Chonalika Kaul has worked on imagining the urban, and there are many things where we might not agree also, but it's a very interesting book. And when we find this Kavya evidences, this is true that it has its kind of a deviation from the normative text. So when we are looking at this, I'm not going into the details or detailed description. We have many. I have mentioned one from Mrichakatika. The other Mrichakatika is such an interesting text that it gives you all kinds of examples. So here also from the Kavyas also we see that though we have separate quarters for a courtesan, Vashanta Sena's residence in the Mrichakatika seems to have been on the Royal Road and not on a courtesan street. So we had, when we look at the layout of the city in various textual sources, you have different margas, the roads, like Raja Marga. So there is a marga called Veshya Marga, and there the people and the text, the Kavya literature different talks about that how people are thronging in the Veshya Marga and other places. But here, the interesting thing is that you have, even though you have a Veshya Marga, you have a separate space for Vashanta Sena's residence. So, which is for a quarter and not in a, and which seems to have been on the Royal Road. So, therefore, Vasanta Sena as a chief courtesan, as a very important part of the social life, of socio-cultural life of the place, actually gives a separate position. Now, these kind of different kinds of localities, different kinds of people who come to the city is also very much reflected when we read Banavhatta's Harsha Charita, a little different kind of text. It's not a Kavya text, but when we look at the biographical literature, we have this Harsha Charita. And Bana says that to the seeker of wealth, it was the land of philosopher's stone. To merchants, it was the land of profit. To artisans, it was a temple of all the arts, and to treasure seekers, it was a mine. And so he is talking about the city of Thaneshwara. Now, coming back to the evidence of Kavyas and other things, what we find that the city seems to be guided not by the standard set by dharmic injunction, but by a different code of cultural accomplishment and material prosperity. The ideal urban man is therefore not the Dharmika Brahmana, but the Nagaraka of the Kama Sutra, wealthy, refined, handsome, socially active, and a connoisseur of visual, literary, and performing arts. But the question then arises, what is the Varna of a Nagaraka? Nowhere do we find the Varna of a Nagaraka, but we have exemplars of as Nagaraka, and again we go back to the Mritchakatika. In case of Charudatta, he was a Brahmana but a merchant, and of course a very important Nagaraka. So therefore, the Varna of a Nagaraka is again another question. I move on to another text called the Dashakumara Charita, and where the protagonist is a Nagaraka. We have a series of protagonists there, and it's a Nagaraka par excellence, and this all of them are Nagaraka par excellence. They are extremely handsome, courteous, skilled in romance. Their skills at different arts are visible. And recently, Kanat Sinha had written an excellent chapter on these Dashakumar Charita in our book, Exploring Urbanity, which I have co-edited with Urbi Mukhopadhyay, where he talks about he shows the Dashakumara Charita protagonists freely moving from one place to another. The Brahmana magician Indra Jalika, the Videshwara roams from country to country to entertain kings. The philanderer Kamapala not only journeys from Pushpapuri to Varanasi, but after dramatic reversals of fortune establishes himself as a powerful minister. A painter travels from Ujjaini to Mathura with a beautiful painting. Kalahakantaka journeys from Mathura to Ujjaini in the guise of a fortune teller, and Chandrapalita comes to Vidarbha from Asmaka with the troops of performers and dancing girls. So they are moving, and they're not moving from one village to another. We find that there's a movement, a constant circulation of people from one city to the other. So this is something to be taken note of. And of course, in the Dashakumarata Charita also, there is a notion of an ideal polity. And that ideal polity establishes in Mahishmati, for instance, is characterized by its religiosity, lack of greed, harassment of the heterodox atheists, the Nastikas, purging of criminals, repelling of all enemy plots, and above all, the maintenance of the Varna order. This is the established norm where you have this is an ideal polity where the Chaturvarnya has to be maintained. But this is, as Kanat clearly shows, that this is an utopia. And this utopia is very much different from the reality of Dandin cities where greed predominates, criminals thrive, heterodox religions flourish, and nobody cares about the Varna duties. Thus, the textual sources of various genres indicate the vibrancy of city life and the fact that Brahmanas were not in control of the city. I will end by an example from we have heard a lot about the textual sources, by an example from inscription from Siadoni. Siadoni inscriptions were used extensively both by B.D. Chattopadhyay and Ranavar Chakravarti, but recently a young scholar, Aman Varma, has also written on this, has done a very detailed work on this Siadoni inscriptions. And it talks about people who made donations towards the construction of the temples were mostly Vanikas, and a few of them were local rulers. There are 27 transactions recorded in the inscription, and all the transactions are made on different dates. The first individual mentioned in the inscription, Chanduka, who built the two main temple towns, most of the donations were given by him and his family members to the temples. And they were, Chanduka and his son Nagaka, they were all salt merchants. So it is clear from the evidence that had strong control over the resources and administration of the town and may have participated in its governance. Then we have also, he had two brothers, and the name of the brothers are also given. So here in this inscription, it shows that he had connections with traders in liquor, betel and salt, and with stonecutters, oil makers, and potters. This indicates the strong possibility that he was the Nagara Sreshti, that is the head of the merchants of the town, although this term does not occur in the inscription. it is not unlikely that Nagaka was a member of the Panchakula committee, which is very important. So therefore, there are other individuals also who built temples, were also from the merchant class, with the solitary exception of one called Damodara. He was a Brahmana from the town of Rayakka, who built a temple of Vishnu. Now, Siadoni is the present day Sironkhurd in the Lalitpur district of UP. Now, here we have reference to the planned city. Like, it was not a capital or a planned city, but it's, even if it is unplanned, we have the very important references to the layout of the road network. And this was brought into focus by Chattopadhyay also, and Chakravarti. So the roads were like, you have these different rathyas, Kuratyas, Brihad Rathyas, Vanijoni Rathyas. The Rathya means Marga, means road. So in the inscription, when you have this kind of Rathyas, and it indicates that it was a road that went through the Hatta Rathya, like going through the hattas, the markets. So most of the donations were made near these areas. Then we find there are two types of roads also referred to, and it is certain that Kurathya was a narrow or a minor road or a small road. Brihatarathya is, of course, the main road of the town, and obviously a road related to merchants. So this unplanned was largely unplanned. The division of roads in this manner shows that space management was well developed. Though unplanned cities, roads were very properly developed. So, and interestingly, I mentioned that the major of the most important merchant groups of the Nagaka were like, the Nagaka was the son, they were of salt merchants, Chanduka and Nagaka. But in one place, they mention that they belong to the Nemaka Jati. Now, this is very interesting, that they become jati. So they were merchants, and then they are, indicates that they have their jati status, which indicates their exclusiveness and social compactness. So these records foreground the class and caste character of the social groups and their relationship with power. So in this case too, the predominance of the merchant groups is visible. So what I was trying to argue, that when we look at an urban center, how far in ancient India, in the early historic period, and of course in a little bit of the early medieval, which I have touched, how far we can talk about the four-fledged Varna divisions, the ordered social order reflected in the normative texts, now can be questioned. The ethos of a city encouraged, and why they can be questioned, because these were cities, and the ethos of the city encouraged doubts, encouraged questioning. And so therefore, I would urge here the participants who are looking at early Indian social history, economic history from this point of view, to not to go by the just blindly follow the prescriptive normative text. Dharma Shastra cannot give us a full picture of lived experiences. To get a picture of lived experiences, we have to look at the Shramanic literatures, Jainism, and not only confine ourselves to the Brahmanical texts. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Ghosh, for your lecture. And I think this will provide enough methodological directions for the participants how to address early Indian history or early medieval Indian history. I think we can now have few questions from our participants, and if you permit me, they can probably allow you to ask a question in Bangla also. So
sure, always, yes. Nishchay.
One thing I would like to question that the essay that you mentioned, written by Professor B.D. Chattopadhyay, would you please repeat that name?
This is called The City in Early India, Perspectives from Texts.
Okay.
This is a very important essay, and this is in one of his collection of the Studying Early India book, where he actually talks of cityness, that how cities are different from the village, and this is very important.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thank
I think you can give your students also to.
Yeah. I will circulate the references that you have made here. I have already downloaded those and I will circulate to them. Yeah, thank you.
And I can give further if you want.
Yeah, sure. Then if you just provide me for the study materials, then I will circulate all that things. Thank you.
Yeah, references.
Okay, so this is open for discussion right now. You can ask questions in English or in Bangla.
হ্যাঁ, বাংলায় করা যাবে, কোনো অসুবিধা নেই।
হ্যালো ম্যাম।
প্লিজ।
হ্যাঁ, প্রীতি ঘোষ এবং প্রণয় সাহা।
ঠিক আছে
ম্যাম বলছিলাম যে আপনি বললেন না যে ব্রাহ্মণরা একটা টাইমে মানে শহরের উপরে এই যে কাস্টের যে ব্যাপারটা সেটা কন্ট্রোল আর করতে পারছে না, অন্য একটা টাইম ছেড়ে দিতে হচ্ছে কাজে পেশে। এখানে যে আর একটা নাটক বলা হলো যে কম্পহারা নাটক, সেখানের ক্ষেত্রেও কি মানে ওই যে গ্রাম থেকে সুন্দরী রমণীরা আসছে, নাটক তারা করছে, তাদের হাইট এবং তাদের সুন্দর দেখতে, তারা নাচ গান যে প্রেজেন্টেশন দিচ্ছে শহরে এসে, তারাও তো সেই গ্রাম থেকেই আসছে, তাহলে গ্রামের দিক থেকেও কি প্রয়োজনীয়তাটাই সব থেকে বেশি হয়ে গেছে কাস্টের ক্ষেত্রে? আমি এটা একটু জানতে চাই।
আচ্ছা, এটা আমি বোধহয় খুব নিজেকে ভালো করে বোঝাতে পারিনি। একটা হচ্ছে, প্রথমত পুম্পোহার হচ্ছে একটা শহর। হ্যাঁ, বইটার নাম হচ্ছে শিলাপতিকরম। শিলাপতিকরম একটা খুব ইম্পর্টেন্ট তামিল টেক্সট। আচ্ছা, তো সেখানে ইলাঙ্গো আদিগাল বলে একজন, তার লেখা তামিল টেক্সট যেটাকে ইউজ করা হয়েছে। এখানে যখন পুম্পুহারের ডিসক্রিপশন দেওয়া হচ্ছে তখন শহরের কথা বলা হচ্ছে, আর তারা গ্রাম থেকে এসছে সেটা কিন্তু বলা হচ্ছে না, মানে এটা শহরেরই চিত্র। যখন বলছে যে দেখো প্রথম লাইনে বলছে, ইন দ্য সিটি ইটসেলফ স্টুড দ্য কিংস ওয়ে, দ্য ফ্ল্যাগড কার, দ্য স্ট্রিট, দ্য মার্কেট স্কোয়ার। কাজে শহরের মধ্যে এরা আছেন, দে আর পার্ট অফ দ্য সিটি লাইফ, ওরা বাইরে থেকে কিন্তু আসছে না, বুঝেছো? কাজে এই যে অ্যাক্ট্রেসেস যারা ফুল, দেন আমরা প্রচুর মালিনীর কথা পাই, ফ্লাওয়ার গার্লস, বেটল নাট সেলার, এরা সবাই রয়েছে, তারা কিন্তু পার্ট অফ দ্য সিটি। আর তোমার প্রথম প্রশ্নটা যেটা আমি যেটা বলতে চেয়েছি যে আমরা যদি খুব ভালো করে দেখো, আমি কিন্তু আরবান এবং রুরাল ডাইকটমির কথা বলছি না, যে একদম ওয়ান অপোজ টু দ্য আদার, এই বাইনারি অপোজিশনে আমি কিন্তু বিশ্বাস করি না। ইটস নট, কারণ একটা শহরের একেবারে পাশেই কিন্তু আবার গ্রাম থাকে, এবং গ্রাম থেকে শহরে লোকে আসছে যাচ্ছে, সেটা থাকছে। কিন্তু অনেক সময় অনেকগুলো টেক্সট, মানে এই ব্রাহ্মণিক্যাল টেক্সট গুলোতে দেখা যাচ্ছে, বা এমনি অনেক টেক্সটে আছে যে মানে এখানে ব্রাহ্মণরা আসতে চাইছে না কেন, মানে বারণ করা হচ্ছে টেক্সটে, শহরে যেও না। কেন বলছে? যে কারণ এখানে বেদ চর্চা হয় না, এখানে এত চারপাশে এত আওয়াজ, কারণ বেদ চর্চার জন্য একটা নির্দিষ্ট নিবিষ্ট মনে করা উচিত, এখানে এত আওয়াজ, এর জন্য শব্দটা ক্যাকোফোনি কথা বলা হচ্ছে। কারণ আমরা তো জানি বাজারে কি হয়, বাজারে কে কার কথা কয় কেউ শোনে না, মানে এইরকম কথার তো প্রচলন আছেই, যে বাজার অনেককে মিলে যখন আমরা কথা বলি, ক্লাসরুমে তো বলি এটা কি বাজার হচ্ছে নাকি, যে মাছের বাজার বানিয়েছো, যে সো বাজার, দ্য হোল ওয়ার্ড মার্কেট ইন্ডিকেটস ক্যাকোফনি, নয়েজ। আর এইটার এগেইনস্টেই কাজে এরা বলছেন যে ব্রাহ্মণিক্যাল অথর্সরা বলছেন যে এখানে যেহেতু ভালো করে বিদ্যার চর্চা হয় না, বেদ পাঠ হয় না, কাজে স্নাতক যারা পড়াশোনা করে তারা কম, যেও ওখানে গেলে তোমরা নষ্ট হয়ে যাবে। এবার এই যে ব্যাপারটা, এটা কিন্তু ইটস এ ভেরি কমন সেন্টিমেন্ট দ্যাট লাইজ আন্ডারলাইন এভরিথিং। এখনো খুব গ্রামের ছেলেদের মা বাবাদের চিন্তা থাকে, তারা যখন ছেলেকে মা মেয়েকে পড়াতে পাঠায় শহরে, একটা চিন্তা থাকে যে শহরের দূষণ, গ্রামে আমরা অনেক নিশ্চিন্ত, শহর তাদেরকে খারাপ করে দিল কিনা। এই যে ব্যাপারটা, এই জিনিসটা কিন্তু আদিকাল থেকেই রয়েছে। এবং এখানে আমি যেটা বলতে চাইছি যে শহরে গেলে আমরা বর্ণপ্রথার এই চারটা, আমি একটু ছোট্ট করে এটা জাস্ট বুঝিয়ে দিই, তাহলে অন্যরাও যারা এই যে একটা কনফিউশন আছে, চতুর্বর্ণ থাকবে, চতুর্বর্ণের যে বিভিন্ন মিশ্রণ হচ্ছে, বর্ণ সংকর যেটাকে আমরা বলি, তার ফলে জাতি তৈরি হচ্ছে। জাতি দু রকমের ভাবে হয়, একটা হচ্ছে ধরো ব্রাহ্মণের সঙ্গে, যেমন খুব খারাপ, মানে চন্ডাল কেন, মানে ব্রাহ্মণ মহিলা এবং একেবারে শূদ্র পুরুষ, যেটা হচ্ছে প্রতিলোম বিবাহ। তো এই ধরনের বিবাহ বর্ণসংকর, এবং তার ফলে জাতি তৈরি হচ্ছে। কারণ অফস্প্রিংকে কি বলা হবে? আরেকটা ক্যাটেগরি অফ জাতি হচ্ছে এই যে নেমকো জাতি বললাম, যে যারা একটা সেম প্রফেশনে রয়েছে, তারা এন্ডোগামাস, তারপরে তারা কি করছে, নিজেদের মধ্যে বিয়ে করছে, নিজেদের মধ্যে খাওয়া দাওয়া করছে, করে একটা জাতি ফরমেশন হচ্ছে। এবার ব্রাহ্মণিক্যাল অথর্সরা কি করছিল, তারা কিন্তু এই জাতি ফরমেশনের একটা হায়ারার্কি, এই হিয়ারার্কিটা খুব, এটার কথা প্রফেসর জোৎকাও বলছিলেন, যে সোশ্যাল হিয়ারার্কি, এই মানে প্রেজেন্ট টাইমেও দেখবে যে গ্রামে গঞ্জেও কিন্তু সোশ্যাল হিয়ারার্কি আছে। কাজে এই যখন সোশ্যাল হিয়ারার্কিটা তৈরি করছিল, সেখানে আবার যেমন সুবর্ণকার এরা সবাই কিন্তু শূদ্র বর্ণের মধ্যে পড়ে যাচ্ছে, সুবর্ণকার, কংসকার। কিন্তু তাহলেও লিস্ট যখন তৈরি হচ্ছে, সুবর্ণকার কিন্তু কংসকারের ওপরে। তার কারণ সুবর্ণকার যারা, তারা ডিল করে উইথ প্রেশাস মেটাল, গোল্ড, আর কংসকার তো কাঁসার কোনো মূল্যই নেই, কাজে ফলে কাঁসা নিচে। এই ধরনের জিনিস হচ্ছে। তো কাজে আমি যেটা বলতে চাইছি যে ব্রাহ্মণ্যের আধিপত্য সেইটা শহরে কিন্তু সেইভাবে হতে পারেনি, কারণ শহরের মধ্যে আরো অনেক কিছু ঘটে চলেছে। এই লোকেরা আসছে, মানে মার্চেন্টস আছে, তারপরে তোমার বণিকরা আছে, কারুশিল্পের লোকেরা, কারুশিল্পটা খুব ইম্পর্টেন্ট, আর্টিসানস, তাদের ট্র্যাডিশনাল নলেজ, তাদের এইগুলো। বুঝেছো? ক্লিয়ার হয়েছে?
হ্যাঁ ম্যাম, থ্যাংক ইউ।
আচ্ছা, প্রণয় সাহা।
হ্যাঁ, থ্যাংক ইউ ম্যাম আপনার লেকচারের জন্য। আমি ভাবছিলাম, যেমনি আমরা দেখলাম কি, আমার আওয়াজটা আসছে?
হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ, একদম আসছে।
হ্যাঁ, আমরা যেমনি দেখলাম কি
বলে ফেলো কখন কানেকশন।
অ্যানশিয়েন্ট ইন্ডিয়ার লিভড এক্সপিরিয়েন্সে কেমন করে ব্রাহ্মণিক্যাল হায়ারার্কি, বর্ণার যে হায়ারার্কি, স্ট্রিক্ট হায়ারার্কিটা, সেটা ব্রেক হচ্ছে আর অনেক কিছুর মধ্যে উলট পালট হয়ে যাচ্ছে, তাই না? But out of curiosity, I'm asking, but was it the lack of proliferation of direct philosophical and ideological attack on, say, the Brahminical ideology, যের কারণে বারে বারে আবার ব্রাহ্মণিক্যাল আইডিওলজিটা কোনো সময় আবার চলে আসছে, আবার আবার পরে প্রলিফারেট করবে আগে, মানে দিস, মানে was there a lack of
বুঝতে পেরেছি, ল্যাক অফ ব্রাহ্মণিক, মানে যেটা জিজ্ঞেস করতে চাইছেন যে ল্যাক অফ ব্রাহ্মণিক্যাল ইডিওলজি, যেটা, সেটা কি?
what I was getting to, was there a lack of in ancient India, was there a lack of direct philosophical and ideological attack on Brahminical ideology, যার পরিপ্রেক্ষে, মানে ইভেন দো লিভড এক্সপিরিয়েন্সে বর্ণা আইডিওলজিটা কিছুভাবে অ্যাটাক, মানে কিছুভাবে উলটপালট হচ্ছে, বাট পুরোপুরি ওইটার এসেন্সটা চলে যাচ্ছে না।
আচ্ছা আচ্ছা, হ্যাঁ ঠিক আছে। আচ্ছা, প্রথমত একটা কথা বলি, আমি যখন আমাদের যে গল্পটা কথা বলছি, সোর্সগুলো করছি, এখানে প্রফেসর জোধকা's কমেন্ট, মেটেরিয়ালিটি, উনি একটা আরবান স্পেসের সঙ্গে মেটেরিয়ালিটি প্রশ্ন এনেছিলেন, যে মেটেরিয়ালিটি এবং মেটেরিয়াল কালচারটাই অ্যাকচুয়ালি খুব ইম্পর্টেন্ট ফর আন্ডারস্ট্যান্ডিং অ্যান আরবান স্পেস। আর ফিলসফির যে এটা মোটেই, মানে এটা কিন্তু নয়, ফিলসফির যে ইডিওলজিক্যাল জায়গা থেকে কিন্তু এই যে শামানিক রিলিজন, এরা তো কনস্ট্যান্টলি দে ওয়্যার টকিং এগেইনস্ট ব্রাহ্মণিক্যাল রিলিজন, মানে এরকম এমন নয় যে তারা দে ওয়্যার নট অ্যাটাকিং। আজকে আর একে ওই সময়টা কত রকমের হচ্ছে, থিঙ্ক অফ চারবাকিজম ইজ অলসো কমপ্লিটলি ডিফারেন্ট, মানে সেক্টেরিয়ান রাইভালরি, সেক্টেরিয়ান অ্যাটাকস কিন্তু ভীষণভাবে ছিল। এবং ব্রাহ্মণিক্যাল রিলিজনের মধ্যেও তো আবার বৈষ্ণবিজম, শৈবিজম, আমরা সব আলাদা আলাদা সেক্টস গুলোকে দেখতে পাই, এবং দেয়ার আর লট অফ কনফ্লিক্ট। এন্ড ওটা আজকে তো এটা বলার আমার মানে জায়গা নয়, বাট একটুখানি পড়লে দেখবেন দেয়ার আর লট অফ কনফ্লিক্ট এন্ড কন্ট্রাডিকশনস বিটুইন দিস কাইন্ড অফ ইডিওলজিক্যাল স্পেসেস। কাজেই ইডিওলজিকদের যে কনফ্লিক্ট, এই অ্যাটাকটা কিন্তু ছিলই, যার জন্য এই যে এনশিয়েন্ট ইন্ডিয়ান ট্র্যাডিশনে যে এতটা হাইলি আমরা টেক্সচুয়াল ট্র্যাডিশন দেখতে পাচ্ছি, এগুলো কিন্তু তৈরি হচ্ছে বিকজ দেয়ার আর ডাউটস, দেয়ার আর কোয়েশ্চেন্স। এই কোয়েশ্চেন্স গুলো কিন্তু আসছে, সেটার কিন্তু কোনো ইয়ে নেই। কিন্তু আমি যেটা বলতে চাইছি যে লিভড এক্সপিরিয়েন্সে যখন আমরা মেটেরিয়াল কালচার, আজকে আমি আর্কিওলজিকে আনিনি সেভাবে, কিন্তু আমার বক্তব্যের মধ্যে মেটেরিয়ালিটি এসেছে, যে আজকে বাজারে যখন কেউ কিছু বিক্রি করছে, ধরো একজন পটার, সে তো তার নিজের যে ভেসেলস গুলো নিয়ে যাচ্ছে বাজারে, তো দ্যাট ইজ দ্য, আমরা যখন অনেক বছর পরে ওই জায়গাটা এক্সকেভেশন হলে ওই পটারিটা বেরোবে, তখন আমরা জানবো যে ডেইলি লাইফে কি ধরনের পটারি ইউজড হচ্ছে। এই যে জায়গাটা, দিস ইজ আ লিভড এক্সপিরিয়েন্স, সেটা বলতে চাইছি যে ব্রাহ্মণরা সর্বা ব্রাহ্মণদের এই যে ক্লিয়ার ডিমার্কেশন অফ টেরিটরিজ, যে এখানে ব্রাহ্মণরা থাকে, এখানে শূদ্ররা, এখানে বৈশ্যরা, সেই টেরিটরিটা আমরা শুধুমাত্র আমরা ইডিওলজি, মানে আমরা প্রেসক্রিপটিভ টেক্সটে পাচ্ছি, কিন্তু আমরা যখন লিভড এক্সপিরিয়েন্সে যাচ্ছি সেটা হচ্ছে না। সাপোজ আপনি ধরুন একটা ফেস্টিভ্যাল, একটা মানে ইফ দের ইজ আ ফেস্টিভ্যাল, সেখানে কি হচ্ছে, সেখানে তো অনেক লোক, প্রসেশনস, আমরা প্রচুর ভিজুয়ালস, আজকে আমি ভিজুয়ালস আনিনি বিকজ উই আর টকিং অন কাস্ট, এমনিতে আরবানিটির ক্ষেত্রে আমি প্রচুর ভিজুয়ালস দেখাই, এবং ভিজুয়ালস গুলো দেখলে দেখা যাবে দেয়ার আর লট অফ প্রসেশনস। এবার এই প্রসেশনসে তো সব মানুষ যাচ্ছে, ইটস নট দ্যাট যে বৈশ্যরা আলাদা যাচ্ছে, আলাদা গ্রুপ, একসঙ্গে একটা ঢল যাচ্ছে, জনতার ঢল। তো সেইখানে কিন্তু একসঙ্গে কিন্তু আমরা দে আর শেয়ারিং দ্য সেম স্পেস, ডিফারেন্ট কাইন্ডস অফ পিপল। দ্যাট ইজ দ্য ডিফারেন্ট অফ আ, তার জন্য বলছি যে এনশিয়েন্ট ইন্ডিয়ার যে যদি আমরা চিত্রগুলো দেখি, আমরা ভিজুয়াল এক্সপিরিয়েন্সেস গুলো দেখি, তাহলে ওই স্ট্রং ডিমার্কেটেড লাইন্স অফ ব্রাহ্মণ কোয়ার্টার্স, Shudra quarters, Vaishya quarters, Kshatriya to of course palace and the nearby, এই স্ট্রং ডিমার্কেট, ক্ষত্রিয়টাই আমরা একমাত্র ডিমার্কেটেড লাইন দেখতে পাই যে দে আর লিভিং ইন আ প্যালেস। কিন্তু আলাদা করে এই পুরো কোয়ার্টার্স গুলোর যে ডিস্টিংটিভ জায়গাটা সেটা থাকছে, কিন্তু দ্যাট ইজ দ্য বাউন্ডারি ইজ ব্লার্ড, সেখানে ওই স্ট্রিক্ট ডিমার্কেশনটা থাকছে না। এটা আমরা থ্রেশহোল্ডের মধ্যে মানে এদিক থেকে ওদিক, ওদিক থেকে এদিক যাওয়াটা সুবিধা হচ্ছে। Am I clear?
Thank you, ma'am.
Shagnik Shah has raised his hand. Shagnik.
হ্যাঁ শাগনিক বলো। হ্যালো।
মানে অনেক কিছু মানে ভাবনারে পেলাম।
আমার পড়া
না 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 দু তিনটে জিনিস আমি মানে আপনার মানে আলোচনা থেকে নিয়ে কনসিডার করছি, যেটা নিয়ে ভাবছিও। এক হচ্ছে যে when we are talking about the lack of a Brahminical culture per se, of a Varna Jati kind of thing in the city, we are also finding in the continuum there is what is called Pratyanta Gram, মানে যেখানে again মানে it's a culturally very different kind of gram where the Varna hierarchy is still loose. তো আমরা এই দুটোর যদি কম্পেয়ার করতে চাই in the continuum, how would we do it? এক আর দুই হচ্ছে ম্যাম যে when we are talking about the city, we are always talking about the quarters versus the street. আপনি এক্ষুনি প্রসেসনের কথা বললেন, আমি মোবিলিটির কথাটাও ভাবছিলাম। So how do we deal with মানে streets as a part of city, or there are also streets which are going out through the forest to the village, যেখানে streets are also getting very hostile, so there are different kind of materiality to the streets as well. So how do we also like juxtapose them if we can? Thank you.
And ma'am, if you just allow me to add with Shagnik's comment.
Sure.
Vijay Kumar Thakur wrote an essay in social mobility in urban India. Shagnik was talking about that mobility. So how would we address this mobility, this aspect of mobility in urban spaces, especially compared to this rural spaces?
হ্যাঁ ঠিক, ভেরি গুড। আচ্ছা এটাকে বাংলায় বলি নাকি ইংরেজিতে বলবো?
হ্যাঁ বাংলায় বলুন।
হ্যাঁ বাংলায় বলুন।
মানে ঠিক আছে, আমি শাগনিক ওই শাগনিক আর আপনার শেষের প্রশ্নটা নিয়ে আমি আমি শুরু করছি। মোবিলিটি, দ্য কোয়েশ্চেন অফ মোবিলিটি। শাগনিক, ইফ ইউ রিমেম্বার উই টকড অ্যাবাউট অলসো দ্যাট আমরা যখন দেখছি স্পেস গুলো দেখছি অর্থশাস্ত্রে বিভাগ, বস্তু বিভাগ, তখন বস্তু ছিদ্র, বস্তু ছিদ্র ইজ আ ভেরি ইন্টারেস্টিং স্পেস, যেখানে এটা দুর্গ শেষ হয়ে যাচ্ছে, দুর্গর বাইরে একটা বাফার জোন, আমি এটাকে বাফার জোন বলছি, ব্রজবাবু বলেছেন একটা এমনি স্পেস যেটা হচ্ছে, সেইখানে কারা থাকছে না শ্রেণী, গিল্ড অ্যাক্টিভিটিস চলছে, আর শ্রেণী থাকছে আর বাইরের মার্চেন্টসরা থাকছে। তার মানে এই যে মুভমেন্ট, তাহলে এই যে গুডস এর মুভমেন্ট, ধরো গুডস গুলো তৈরি হচ্ছে উইদিন দ্য আরবান স্পেস, তারপরে এই বস্তু বিভাগের সেকশনে আমাদের কোয়ার্টার্স গুলো রয়েছে যেখানে তারা তৈরি করছে, তারপরে কিন্তু যেগুলো বাইরে, যেগুলো মানে ট্রেডিং এ যাচ্ছে, সব কোর্স তো না, ইন্টারনালিও কনজিউমড হয় অনেক কিছু, সেইগুলো কিন্তু ওই গোয়িং থ্রু দ্য বস্তু ছিদ্র, কারণ শ্রেণী তখন কিন্তু ভেরি স্ট্রং। এটা আমরা পোস্ট মডার্ন পিরিয়ড বা আর্লি পিরিয়ড যদি দেখি, তখন আমরা কিন্তু তখন দেখছি গিল্ড লাইক অ্যাক্টিভিটিস খুব স্ট্রং। আমরা যে শ্রেষ্ঠী এইসব টেক্সট, আমি যে টেক্সটগুলোর কথা পাচ্ছি সেটা খুব ইম্পর্টেন্ট হচ্ছে শ্রেষ্ঠী গাহাপতি আলাদা করে রয়েছে। তো ফলে এই যে জোনটা যেখানে শ্রেষ্ঠীরা রয়েছে, যেখানে গিল্ড লাইক অ্যাক্টিভিটিস গুলো হচ্ছে, তো সেটা শহরের বাইরের থেকে সেখানে যাচ্ছে, ওখান থেকে জিনিসগুলো গ্রামে যাচ্ছে কিংবা অন্য শহরে এগুলো ট্রান্সশিফট হচ্ছে। এটা হচ্ছে আমরা রুটস যখন বলবো, আমাদের দুটো রকমের রুটস এর কথা মাথায় রাখতে হবে। একটা রুটস হচ্ছে উইচ আর দ্য ট্রেডিং রুটস, যেটা বাইরে যাচ্ছে। আরেকটা রুটস হচ্ছে যেটা উইদিন দ্য স্পেস, উইদিন দ্য লোকাস অফ আ সিটি আমরা যে রুটসটা দেখতে পাচ্ছি। কাজে যখন এবং তুমি ইউ রাইটলি পয়েন্টেড আউট যে আমি কোয়ার্টার্স গুলোকে আলাদা করছি। হ্যাঁ, কোয়ার্টার্স গুলো, কারণ আমরা যদি পালি সাহিত্য দেখি, আমরা এত ভালো করে মানে এই আলাদা কাম্মারা গামা, কাম্মারা বিথি, মানে এরকম আলাদা আলাদা করে রয়েছে। সো দে ওয়ার স্টেইং টুগেদার, দ্যাট ইজ ট্রু। কিন্তু যখন রোডস গুলোর কথা আসছে সেখানে কিন্তু there is no discordant note. These people can travel to this road, these people can travel to that road. So all the margas are leading to the hatto. So when you are going to the margas hatto, you have to cross those margas. এর জন্য এটা কথাটা আসছে যে এক্সক্লুসিভ হচ্ছে না। we people যতই আমরা বর্ণতে অর্থশাস্ত্রে আলাদা আলাদা জায়গা দেখানো আছে, ইট ক্যানট বি এক্সক্লুসিভ। ব্রজত বাবু বলেছেন, আমরাও আমাদের স্টাডিতে দেখাচ্ছি যে এক্সক্লুসিভ হয় না, মানুষকে তো যেতে হচ্ছে। তো সেই যে ট্রাভার্সিং দ্যাট রুট, দ্যাট ইজ আছে। মোবিলিটির প্রশ্নটা আমরা খুব ভালো পাই যখন আমরা দেখি এই কনভার্জেন্স, সিটি অ্যাজ আ পয়েন্ট অফ কনভার্জেন্স। সেখানে যখন দেখছি আজকে সাকলোর এক্সাম্পল, একটা পোর্ট টাউনের এক্সাম্পল যেগুলোই নাও, তাহলে দেখা যাচ্ছে যে বাইরের থেকে অনেক জিনিস ওই বাজারে ঘুরছে। সাউথ ইন্ডিয়াতে কর্ণাটকে অনেক ইনস্ক্রিপশনস আছে, নর্থ ইন্ডিয়াতে এই যে মন্ডপিকা, পেন্ঠা, এই যে মিডল ক্যাটাগরি মার্কেট অর্গানাইজেশন গুলোর কথা পাচ্ছি, এগুলো উইদিন দ্য প্রেসিংস অফ এন আরবান স্পেস। হ্যাঁ, একটা ছোট, অনেক সময় হয়তো বড় আরবান স্পেস নয়, কিন্তু ইনসিপিয়েন্ট আরবান বা আরবান স্পেস হচ্ছে। সেখানে ধরো নর্থের দিকে যখন আমি পাচ্ছি যে গোলমরিচ আসছে, তো সেই গোলমরিচটা আনছে কে? সে তো মালাবার থেকে আসছে। কাজে একটা কোস্টাল রুট ধরে সেখানে যেতে পারে, আবার সরাসরি ভেতরের ইন্টিরিয়র রুট থেকে যেতে পারে। আমরা যখন পেরিপ্লাস, এটা বলে আমি শেষ করছি, অন্য প্রশ্ন থাকতে পারে, পেরিপ্লাস দেখছি, পেরিপ্লাসে ভরুকচ্ছের কথা বলা হচ্ছে, বারুগাজা খুব ইম্পর্টেন্ট একটা পোর্টন। পেরিপ্লাস কিন্তু ক্লিয়ারলি তার হিন্টারল্যান্ডস এর কথা বলছে, যে এখানে কাপড় আসছে কোথা থেকে? টের মানে টগরো, এনশিয়েন্ট টগরো, কর্ণাটক আরেকটু ভেতরে, এবার ওখান থেকে আসছে প্রতিষ্ঠান, পৈঠান থেকে ভরুকাচ্ছ। তাহলে আমরা ওই হিন্টারল্যান্ডের কনসেপ্ট, যখন শহর বললে কিন্তু হিন্টারল্যান্ডও এসে যায়। কাজে তুমি যে গ্রামের কথা বলছো এবং এই যে ইয়েটা, এটা খুব, মানে এর জন্য আমি বারবার বলছি যে বাইনারি অপোজিশন নয়, গ্রাম থেকে তো লোকেরা আসছে। তো এই যে আমরা টগর থেকে প্রতিষ্ঠান থেকে, তাহলে প্রতিষ্ঠান হচ্ছে কন্টিনিউয়াস হিন্টারল্যান্ড আর টগর হচ্ছে ডিসকন্টিনিউয়াস হিন্টারল্যান্ড। তো এই পুরো জিনিসটা ধরে আমাদের কিন্তু একটা আরবান স্পেসকে পড়া দরকার, রিড আউট করা দরকার।
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah. Is there any other question? We can have a question, I think. Yeah. This will probably be the last question.
One question, I think, at least.
Yeah.
অনেকক্ষণ ধরে বসে আছে সবাই, আর প্রশ্ন নেই।
হ্যাঁ, আর প্রশ্ন নেই সম্ভবত। ঠিক আছে, আমরা এই সেশনটা এখানেই শেষ করছি। অনেক ধন্যবাদ আপনাকে।
Thank you very much, Vijit. I did not say thanks in the beginning because I was thinking that I'll run out of time. So thank you very much for organizing this, and this is a very important issue that you have taken up. And just last one point, Shagnik is also here, and there are other answers that some of you might think that why I didn't bring Moyomoto, because when you have a text on architecture which talks on the planning and urban planning, ওখানে ভিলেজের কথা বলা আছে, আরবান শহরের কথা বলা আছে, এবং সেখানে খুব ইন্টারেস্টিং আছে। ময়োমতো ক্যান বি ডেটেড ফ্রম দ্য 9th to the 12th, আর খুব ইন্টারেস্টিং বলে আছে যেখানে পিপল অফ অল ক্লাসেস লিভ, মানে ক্লাসেস, জন শব্দটা ব্যবহার করা, আসলে শব্দটা হচ্ছে জন। প্রাচীন ভারত চর্চায় না শব্দগুলো খুব ইম্পর্টেন্ট, আমরা অনেক সময় ট্রান্সলেট করি খুব ব্ল্যাঙ্কেটলি। তো জনরা সবাই থাকছে এখানে, মিশ্রিত জনদের কথা বলা হচ্ছে, পিপল অফ অল ক্লাস, পিপল অফ অল পিপল লিভ। তো বারবারই যখন আরবান সেন্টারের কথা বলা হচ্ছে সেটা লিখছি, কিন্তু আমি এটা আনিনি বিকজ ইটস আ টিপিক্যাল ব্রাহ্মণিক্যাল থিওরিটিক্যাল ট্রিটিস। আই ওয়ান্টেড টু গো ফর সামথিং দ্য ডিফারেন্ট কাইন্ডস। কিন্তু ইন্টারেস্টিংলি ওখানে বলছে শূদ্রদের একটা আলাদা জায়গা, সেটা হচ্ছে খেটো, দ্যাট ইজ অনলি ইনহ্যাবিটেন্টস অফ দ্য শূদ্রস। তার মানে কি, এই যে বলছে যে একবার, তাহলে কন্ট্রাডিকশনটা দেখো, এই যে একবার বলছে যে পিপল অফ সর্বজন থাকছে একটা শহরে, সর্বজন সব লোক থাকে, তাহলে আবার শূদ্রদের যে আলাদা করে দিচ্ছে, যে আলাদা শহর শূদ্রদের জন্য, তাহলে কি এই সর্বজনের মধ্যে শূদ্ররা নেই? এই প্রশ্নগুলো আসে। হ্যাঁ, কাজে ব্রাহ্মণিক্যাল লিটারেচার অনেক প্রবলেম আছে, সেগুলোকে আমাদের ইয়ে করে দেখতে হবে। ঠিক আছে, থ্যাংক ইউ। চলো এবার go for lunch. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So this has to be the lunch break right now. So we will we'll meet again at 1:30 p.m. I would request you, if possible, to join the meeting link again at 1:25 p.m. just 5 minutes before the commencement of the next session, And as you know, Dr. Ranjita Datto, Jawaharlal, from Center for Historical Studies, JNU, will deliver the next lecture here. She will be speaking on caste in medieval South Indian temple cities. So please be there with us at 1:25 p.m. Thank you all.
Should we leave the,
Yes, you may leave. Yes, you may leave. You may stay here.
or can
It's
we
up to
stay
you.
here?
Yeah, absolutely. It's up to you.
Thank you.